just to listen and celebrate and hear what Eli has to say on grief. And I just thank you for him. I thank you for his life. I thank you for the 13 years that he's been at MCA and what a joy he is. I just ask that you'll give him clarity of thought, that he will just be relaxed as he communicates what he's learned and what God has taught him. In your name I pray all these things. Amen.
I know exactly how you feel. Everything happened for a reason. Other people have it worse. These are all phrases we hear commonly associated with grief. People will say these things in moments when they do not know what to say. It's awkward for many people, and these are attempts to ease that tension. When people try to comfort us, it makes us feel even more uncomfortable and does not help us towards any end goal of feeling better. These are often just space fillers because silence is not easy to sit with. People do not say these things to hurt us or put us down intentionally. They say them because grief is hard to sit with, and it's very uncomfortable. From an outside perspective, these phrases may seem helpful to someone who is grieving. These phrases can undermine the acknowledgement of how deep the pain is and shift the focus from their pain and irritation to your statement. These phrases can deepen the pain of the person grieving and cause confusion about their own emotions. Grief cannot be eased with a simple phrase. The person feels isolated by the statement and is left lonelier than before the advice was given. These responses show a wide misunderstanding of grief in our modern world because most people haven't explored what grief truly is. They truly believe they're giving comfort with these empty phrases because some of the grief I've experienced and those close to me have experienced, I wanted to dive into misconceptions about grief, how to process grief better, and what I can do for someone else experiencing this. Before we do anything else, we have to define what grief is. Grief is the emotional and physiological distress caused by loss in one's life. This is a combined definition from the APA and Mayo Clinic. When people think of a definition of grief, they most likely will think of how someone is affected mentally by the physical loss of someone in their lives, but it goes much deeper. Grief affects our minds and thoughts, causing emotional stress, but it also causes physiological stress, which is stress on the physical body. This can affect you in many ways. An individual may experience fatigue, trouble sleeping or staying asleep, GI problems, and a weaker immune system. One more physical phenomenon that is hard to believe but well documented is something called BHS, broken heart syndrome. This is when someone experiences so much grief that they have a physical heart attack. This shows that grief does not just affect how someone thinks, it affects their whole body, both physically and mentally. But what is grief in our everyday lives? Most people think grief is just the physical loss of someone in our lives, like a death. But one may grieve over divorce, moving houses, losing a job, or even losing who we think we are as a person. I want to dive deeper into the divorce side of this, as it's a tough subject and needs to be talked about more often. Because I believe people do not fully understand the grief caused by divorce. This kind of grief, along with other non-death grief experiences, are more commonly minimized by society because we treat death as the only real loss one can experience. In a death grief experience, there's a funeral, which is the physical evidence of your loss. In a non-death grief experience, there's no measurable evidence for your loss. The reality of the loss is harder for those around you to recognize. These kinds of grief are just as detrimental. The loss is equal to a death because you lost the life you had. Our brains are good at creating futures. They like predictability. With divorce, a perceived future is lost and replaced with a blank page of unknowns. Grief is the loss of what you thought your life would look like. The same thing happens with a job. If you're passionate about your job and you lose it, it means you lost the future you thought was secure. Grieving is also given a timeline people expect you to follow depending on the degree of loss measurable by society. This is not how it works, though. Grief can feel insurmountable when faced all at once. Grief takes time, and we do not know how long it will take. The process of grieving isn't linear. One will have ups and downs, happy and sad days, and I think we are meant to have ups and downs in our grieving process. It is okay to have ups while you are grieving. You do not need to feel guilty to be happy. Just having fun with someone or feeling joy can bring relief. These moments can be emotional breathers and give us time to rest and rejuvenate. Grief and joy can coexist. It does not discount the severity of someone's situation. A common reaction to experiencing joy can be guilt. The guilt sometimes manifests when one realizes that one can feel better at times. Also, the feeling that the loved one is being forgotten or can't be there to experience the joy with you. Something usually discussed when talking about grief is the stages of grief. These stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Some people view these stages as something that have to be moved through from one thing to another in a certain order. This is a very detrimental way to look at grief, especially in the household. The stages of grief are not linear. They do not happen in a certain order. For example, if someone you lose someone in your family, one person could be angry while another person could be depressed. And then the next day, it could be the totally opposite. Because of this misunderstanding that stages of grief are not linear, many families get into fights or arguments about grief because they think they should all feel the same thing at the same time. They get angry that other members are not feeling the same thing that they are. In the Brothers Karamazov shows this in a good way because it shows how each brother is grieving in their own way. Ivan is grieving in a delayed intellectual way. Dmitri is grieving in an externalized, explosive way, while Alyosha is grieving in an integrated and faith-processed way. Another thing people say is, when will this person or I get to the acceptance stage? This is also very detrimental because some losses will never truly be accepted. This is okay and should be acceptable. In A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, he says, "The pain now is part of the happiness then. That's the deal." If you just listen to that and listen to the pain now is part of the happiness then, it explains a lot and it goes super deep. Living with this grief becomes part of your life. You have to learn how to live with it. Just because you are grieving at some moments does not mean you have to live your life always in this sadness. Learning that this grief will never go away means that you have to learn how to go through life with it. People often think that accepting it means you are okay with it, but this is not true. You can learn to accept grief without being okay with it. Accepting something in your life does not mean it is closure. It just means you are coming to terms with what has happened. The way the loss is viewed will change. It will be horrible at first, and one will think that they cannot go through life anymore. Then later, your capacity for it will grow. At first, when something happens, all you can do is deeply feel the loss and mourn. But as time goes on, we grow to have a greater capacity for this grief, and so it seems to take up less of our lives. Next, I'll discuss the different types of grief. The first one is normal or common grief. This grief is just the way a normal person would see grief. You go through the stages of grief, and it's how someone would describe it if it gets brought up in a normal conversation. The next is anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief is the grief you feel before something actually happens. For example, someone you love is diagnosed with a terminal illness, or your family situation is going downhill, so you know something is going to happen. This kind of grief is when you are thinking about what you will lose in the future with someone. Things as simple as going to get ice cream or playing board games with someone can feel unbearable. In instances of divorce, simple pleasures like not eating dinner as a family anymore are heartbreaking. Grief can show up days, months, or even years before the loss actually happens. In Charles Dickens' Great Expectations, anticipatory grief appears in several ways, one of which is when Pip, the main character, anticipates losing Estella, his love interest. He fears he will never be good enough for her and that she'll hurt him before anything actually happens. The next type of grief I'm going to talk about is disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief is grief that is not recognized by people or society. Some examples of this are loss of home, infertility, loss of identity, loss of a job, and working in the medical field where you see lots of loss. These kinds of losses are not considered real because they do not involve the loss of an immediate family member or friend. When society doesn't see it as grief, we try to dismiss it because it isn't validated by society. We feel weird and out of place for experiencing the sadness we do, so we try to sidestep this process. We may feel so uncomfortable voicing the grief that we feel that we try to do other things instead. A few ways people do this are letting anger engulf us, which men in particular tend to do because anger is more acceptable than sadness in society. We can become depressed, quiet, and withdraw because we do not feel safe sharing our experiences. We also experience something called caretaker grief, which is when one will take care of everyone else around them as a distraction from what is going on in their own bodies, which is especially hard for women. The risk of this is becoming emotionally numb and losing who we are as individuals. This may look acceptable to society, but we must be able to take care of ourselves and recognize what we need before we can take care of others. The last type of grief I'm going to talk about is delayed grief. This is when something terrible occurs. Sometimes the only thing the body can do to handle it is become numb at the time. The sadness would be too much for one to deal with all at once. Therefore, little by little, the sadness is allowed to come in and pass through in a way the body can handle it. Delayed grief can hit you weeks, months, or even years after something happened. Most people will experience some delayed grief, even if it is just for a few days or weeks. This can look like a person living life normally, but being emotionally numb and not even knowing it. When grief hits you, the body may try to suppress it and enter survival mode. Survival mode is an autopilot. They go through the normal motions of their life. This often occurs in children and teenagers, so they can continue on school and growing up and just becoming adults. There are a few other reasons why this grief gets suppressed. They are emotionally overloaded, like I talked about earlier, and not being in a safe space to express their grief. When this grief comes back, it will likely come back due to a trigger, something like an anniversary or birthday, or seeing something that meant a lot to you, or even a certain place that you guys loved. I'm going to talk about my experience with grief. During my freshman year, my parents got divorced. When I think back, I remember a specific event and about 30 minutes after that, and nothing else. Everything faded together or went out. If you asked me who my teachers were or who I was friends with, I would not be able to tell you. I can vaguely remember a few memories with siblings, but other than that, nothing. During this time, my grades dropped, I had no motivation for anything, and during my research on this, I concluded that I experienced an acute stress response that had turned into a traumatic stress response. And eventually, over time, I've been able to process and integrate it into my life. I say this because it started with an initial event that caused instability and emotions of confusion and sadness. It then turned into daily emotional numbness and fog. While researching this paper, I interviewed Mr. McQueen, a marriage and family therapist here in Midland. He used the word disoriented to describe this. He used this word because it encompasses what is happening fully. I was on autopilot, going through the motions of life, and about the time junior year began, I had integrated it enough with my life to have a work ethic and could work on other things in life. I improved and finished out that year strong. After doing some subtle research on this and just thinking about it, I have integrated it into my life. This research is very personal due to my experience, and I can confidently say that this grief will never fully leave me. I have learned how to live with it for now and will continue to try to integrate it into my life. Some people in the church do not get the idea of living with grief because it is a hard concept. We've all heard something like, if you pray harder, it will go away. When we do this, we are making our grief into a faith issue. This is detrimental because it makes people believe the pain or grief is supposed to go away. And when it doesn't, they go to God and wonder why he isn't taking it away from them. We have to learn to live with your grief. We cannot just make it go away with sheer will. In A Grief Observed by C.S. Lewis, he says, "Not that I am, I think, in much danger of ceasing to believe in God. The real danger is coming to believe such dreadful things about him. The conclusion I dread is not, so there's no God after all, so this is what God's really like. Deceive yourself no longer." This points to the question that comes to most believers when dealing with this. Is God good? This shows that grief cannot just affect us mentally and physiologically, but spiritually as well. We can combat this idea that God is not good by practicing a few things. The first is when you love something, you must understand and accept it. You are making yourself open and vulnerable to pain and suffering. It is either that or love nothing at all. The next thing is that you cannot really judge something when you're disoriented by grief. Grief is not a reliable theology. People may also try to rush you through your grief. When they do this, they approach it with a good mindset. They do not consider how it will affect the person who is grieving. Grief can cause great discomfort in those around the aggrieved. So they may attempt to rush you through it. They do not like the silence that grief often carries, and they do not want to sit there and allow you to grieve. People do not understand that allowing someone the space to grieve is the best thing you can do for them. Mr. McQueen said, "We can always express care and concern. It matters to me that you are not okay. This means that we are there for someone even if they need us. It is showing that we care for them, especially when we are silent about how they should grieve. Whenever we do this, it can be awkward, but it is best for them. When we have to submit to it and do what is best for them. Let them be a mess if they need to be. Sit with them in silence if they need that. Do not try to make people better. Everyone grieves in vastly different ways. We cannot fix someone else because most of the time, it's impossible to grasp another's feelings. If I went to my brother right now and asked him how he grieved about my parents' divorce, he would have a wildly different answer than I. We could have a different view of it the whole time, and maybe we will see it differently for the rest of our lives. No matter how close you are to them, you cannot know exactly what another may need. Grief is something we cannot fix. We cannot rush people into a different state of mind or know how they are feeling. It helps to sit back and let people grieve, giving them a safe space to process what has happened. Grief is not linear. It will not follow the same path with anyone, no matter how much alike or how close they were to someone. Grief is different for every person. We cannot help them, because we do not know how they are feeling. We will all feel grief at some point in our lives, and it will always feel comfortable to us and those around us. But if we love them, we will let them be a mess and let them grieve. The harder we grieve for something, the more we care for it. Grief can be used as evidence for how much we love something or someone. Grief is something used to remember people and remember how someone loves something or someone. This is how we are supposed to grieve and how we can truly show that we love those around us. Thank you.
Great job. Great job, Eli. That was
Thank you.
awesome. So what are your plans for next fall?
I'm attending Blaine College in Bryan to study construction science
Construction science. And why did you choose construction science?
because I was going to do architecture, and then I figured that I didn't want to create all the floor plans, but I still wanted to deal with them.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so this is a really heavy paper. It's very long as well. So you did a great job. One of the things, the first thing I wanted to ask you is that when you said at the end, sit with them in silence if they need that. And at the beginning, you talked about phrases that undermine how deep their pain is. Is there anything you can say?
I think all you can really say to someone, it depends on the person, obviously. But at first, with someone, all you can say is, like, I'm here for you, and just sit with them. But if they want advice, then they'll come to you for that. You can't go to them just try to force advice on them.
Okay. My favorite quote that you put in here was the C.S. Lewis quote. The pain now is part of the happiness then. That's the deal. So is grief in any way a healthy or a necessary part of our life?
Yes, I think so. Because going through life, we all have parents, and usually, if we live out our lives, our parents will pass before us. And so we all will have to deal with the grief in one way or another. And so I think it's healthy to learn how to deal with that grief. Because grief isn't healthy in just a normal way. I think you have to learn how to deal with it for it to be healthy.
Okay, so that leads to my next question. In John 11:35, it says that Jesus wept. Do you remember why Jesus wept?
Well, he was going to bring Lazarus back to life, and he was either weeping that Lazarus had died, or he was weeping that Lazarus was in a better place, and he had to bring him back from that.
Okay, it's interesting.
And so you can look at it either way, but
So if you look at it the first way, in that he was there, he got there, Martha and Mary were mourning, and Jesus was touched by them mourning. Why do you think that he just didn't say, "Hey guys, stop crying. It's okay. Nobody cry. I've got this. I'm going to take care of this right now." He went through a process of grieving. Do you think that his example of grieving is something that we should that it is a necessary thing? Like, do you think that is example for us?
I think it can be, because obviously he could have gone and just told them to stop grieving or something, but just like I said in the paper, you don't, even with Jesus, you don't, like, he would, but you don't know how people are feeling. And so he went with them and grieved with them instead of telling them how to grieve.
Or even stopping?
Mm-hmm.
That's good. I never thought about what you said about maybe he was weeping because he knew he was about to raise him back. I never thought about that. So my next question, if you have a believer versus a non-believer, do you think that the believer has an advantage when going through a grieving process over a non-believer?
What do you mean advantage? Like what
Like,
kind?
it can be any kind. Like if you have two people, one's a believer, one's a non-believer, and they both experience a tragic loss in their life, like a death, and we'll just say, because that just feels like the worst. And do you think the believer has an advantage as they walk through all the stages of grief and as they mourn? do they have a leg up on getting through the grieving process versus the non-believer?
I think, especially in Christians, usually we're around good communities and everything. But in these communities, we try to not control a little bit people. And so I think you have an advantage if you have a community who knows what to do. But if you don't, then I don't see that there's an advantage because you would get to the point where you're asking the question, is God good? And that's just going to bring you deeper into confusion and more questions. And so, if anything, if you don't have good people around you with good and the right idea, then it could be a disadvantage
How would it be a disadvantage?
because they're just leading you into more confusion about your own emotions and bringing more stuff into it that won't help.
So do you think that Jesus can help a believer go through grief?
Wait, can you say that again?
If you're processing grief, do you think that Jesus helps people go through grief as they're grieving? Or the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit,
I think so, but I think that you personally also have to understand that your your worldly actions can't change what's happening.
Mhm.
You have to be open to being you have to be open to grieving about it.
Mhm.
And you can't just expect him to guide you all the way through it and just you not feel anything because you should still feel
Yeah.
something when grieving.
Right. I agree with that. I looked up a bunch of verses to see, like, because this, when you and I would talk about this a lot, it it opened my eyes to a lot of like mistakes that I've made. Like when I would say it's going to be okay, and I was like, oh, I've said that to people before that were grieving. So, my favorite verse that I found was, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit," and that was from Psalm 34:18, and it made me think about why the Holy Spirit is called the Comforter, because He can comfort us in our grief. And so, would you say that, because you said we don't want to turn grief into a faith issue, if we look at it, that several times, like in other verses, he healeth the broken in heart and binds up their wounds, would you say that, because a lot of people say that they use religion as a crutch, but in this case, if Jesus is close to the brokenhearted, is that is it okay that he ties up their wounds?
Yes, that's okay, but I think they still felt something,
Right.
obviously. Like and then I forgot the rest of what you said.
That's okay. That's good. um do you think that there are levels of grief where a person can over grieve?
What do you mean over grief?
Like a coworker I had one time at Lee that lost a dog, and the grief was so heavy that for a long time, I thought she had lost a child. And then when I realized, oh, she's talking about her dog, it seemed to me like she was over grieving. Do you think that if someone is over grieving something, is that a thing that you can over grieve?
I think for things like that, it depends on the person for how much you grieve about certain stuff. But I don't think people around you should be able to say if you're over grieving or not.
Okay.
So no, I don't think you can.
That's, yeah, that's a good answer. Okay. I'm going to pass it on to Mr. Nelson.
All right. Well done, Eli. This is a really good topic. I appreciate that you're bringing this up and that you wrote your thesis on it. The first thing I want to talk about is you discuss how most commonly we associate grief with the death of a person. You then go on to talk about other instances of grief that aren't due to physical death, such as divorce, job loss, moving. Are things like divorce, job loss, and moving, are those actually just other types of death?
Yes, they're deaths of something in your life that you
Okay.
thought you had or
Okay.
thought was gonna be in your life forever.
Okay. And so, yeah, it's this death of something that you thought was going to be in your life forever. So, how would this idea of expectations versus reality fit into that? So, I thought I was going to have this job forever, and, something happens and I get laid off. And then, I had that expectation, right? So how are expectations versus reality tied in to grief?
I think that with things like, losing a job or something, that we need to we need to be more open to reality, just like we are with death, because we know people pass. And so if we were like that, I think more it'd be treated more fairly as grief if we were more open to how it's not it's not something that you have and that you can't lose.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, because I think that's such a big part of grief is that I have this expectation for how my life's supposed to go, right? And when life doesn't go the way that I planned it out, the way that I expected it to go, that's when everything starts to fall apart, right? And I think that's where grief comes in because I've mapped out my life, but life's not going the way I mapped it out.
Hmm.
And that's a very tough pill to swallow. Um, you also talk about there being a timeline on grief, as far as like people kind of maybe don't people don't overtly say this, but it feels like there's a
Hmm.
timeline on grief, right? How does being on the outside of somebody else's grief affect your perspective?
I think if you're on the outside, you ex- you look into your own experiences of grief and you look, oh, it took me this long to feel better, or this long to be okay with it, and this long to talk about it with people.
Hmm.
And then you put that expectation on them and expect them to follow the exact same thing that you did. So I don't think everybody has the same timeline, but they all have a timeline that they expect you to follow because they followed it.
Yeah, and with that, you're bringing up this idea of this comparison of grief or comparison of pain. And I don't think comparing pain or comparing grief is ever a healthy thing to do because it is very different. I think the other thing to keep in mind though regarding being on the outside of somebody else's grief, uh, when people are setting up some sort of an expectation on a timeline to stop grieving, is that for the person grieving, they're always still in it. Right. And so for the person grieving, that's something that I think they also have to be mindful of is to not be too harsh with people on the outside because their lives are moving on, right? Whereas for the person grieving, they have this expectation, this reality that they are grieving, but there's still that hole's still always there. And so it is unrealistic to expect that other people are going to continually, they're going to see you and be like, oh, yeah, so he must still be grieving this thing. This thing must still be hurting because in their life, they have other things that are happening, but for the person in the midst of it, it's still there. It's still fresh. It hasn't, it's not something that has just changed, And so I think with grief, a certain measure of grace is also a healthy thing to extend to people on the outside. Um, so do you think that there's such a thing as natural grieving? And by natural grieving, I mean grieving that takes place because of things that are supposed to occur.
Yes, just like I mentioned earlier with like parents and everything, like
Mhm.
in age,
Mhm.
there's people die of natural causes of old age and everything, and it's a natural thing for you to grieve over them. And so I think that you will grieve, and it's
Mm.
it's natural for us.
Yeah. So do you think that there's other less extreme examples of natural grief where it's maybe not, an elderly parent passing away, but it's just like this is something that just is supposed to happen in the course of life?
I think that one thing that's talked about maybe less, but if you expect a job or you grow up expecting to do this in life or something, and you go on a different path,
Hmm.
I think that's one of the things because you don't know your path.
Hmm.
And so I think that's one of the natural grieving.
Okay. What are you going to be doing in about a week and a half on a Saturday?
I'm going to be walking across the stage,
Okay.
hopefully.
Okay. Yeah, that's the goal, right? Um, how is that actually going to be an example of grieving for some people in your life?
Moving away, going to college,
Yeah.
leaving friends.
Yeah, right. And so this is kind of this idea that I'm getting at on natural grieving is for your parents, your their whole life is changing, right? You've been with them for 18 years and they probably already are experiencing this as they're thinking about it, but they're going to be experiencing this natural grief, where everything that they've been building you towards, it's a good thing. They want this for you, but it's all about to change. Okay. Um, what about for you with graduation? What are some natural things that you're going to grieve with that?
Leaving the routine of life, leaving just a place like just knowing how to get around or something like that.
Hmm.
Just small things, being able to drive down the street and see a friend.
Hmm.
Just every small thing like that, I feel like.
Yeah. So with that, knowing that throughout the course of life, we're going to be experiencing these natural griefs as well as sudden griefs, things that, you know, they weren't supposed to happen, right? But they did. Are there things that we can do for natural griefs or sudden griefs to equip ourselves to process grief in a healthier way?
I think knowing that it's part of life and knowing that I think I mentioned it in the end or some I think I did, but how much you love something equals like how much you grieve for it.
Hmm.
And so just knowing that if you're grieving for something, it was something that was good in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. And the other thing that I would mention that I think I would encourage you towards is just creating firm foundations, right? And so I do think there's a very strong element to building a relationship with God that can help us process grief. It doesn't mean that we still don't feel pain. It doesn't mean that, oh, it's easier, right? It can be every bit as difficult, but having that foundation helps. I think another thing I would encourage you toward with it is finding a strong community to support you and who you can talk with about grief. Because you had mentioned in your paper how for men in particular processing grief can be difficult. They process it with anger. I think they also process it by just stuffing it down. And so finding building this foundation uh, where you have people to go to and just talk about it with. And obviously, like you talked about, not looking for an answer, right? But it's like I just need to be able to have people that I can go to who I know are going to support me. And so I would just encourage you to build these foundations in life, knowing that grief will happen again, right? It's not an if, but it is a when. Um, the last things I want to talk about is what does it look like to process grief in a healthy way?
I think that it's hard to define a healthy way to process grief because everybody does it differently. But I mentioned the caretaker grief.
Mhm.
And so I think being aware of your own emotions
Mhm.
and focusing on yourself in that moment, honestly, and just learning your own feelings before so you can help others in the future.
So, what does processing grief in a healthy way look like for you?
I think taking time away from friends definitely
Mhm.
because we have a lot of unserious people around us.
We do. Who is the we are talking about? Okay.
So I think taking time for yourself
Mhm.
and just taking time for myself
Mhm.
and taking a step back and looking at it from an outside perspective.
Yeah, that's good. Um, Some of the best advice I've been given in grief is that when going through grief and just going through life in general, we have to learn to hold grief in one hand and gratitude in the other. Okay. And so, why do you think it's important to hold gratitude equally in the midst of grief?
Well, with like comparing them like in one hand or the other, I think if you didn't have any gratitude, then grief would overcome you and you wouldn't be able to do anything. But if you have too much gratitude, then you're going to overlook the grief and be ignorant to either yourself or those around you. And so I think it just balances it out.
Yeah, right. Because I think balancing the two helps us to maintain a proper perspective on reality, right? Because life isn't all pain, it's not all grief, right? If we're really honest and take time to look at our lives and look around us, there's a lot to be grateful for. But also, it's important to not minimize our pain, minimize our grief, and just pretend that it's not there, because that's unhealthy in a different way. And so that's another thing I would encourage you towards, as you continue going through life and you're going to experience more grief, is try to hold the two equally. Hold gratitude in one hand while you're holding grief in the other. So thanks, Eli.
All right, Eli, as we were coming out here, you said, I remember sitting out in the audience and seeing these people coming up and speaking, and I don't feel like I am those people. And so we're in the middle of this. And so my question was, how are you feeling about you being one of those people now?
It's weird. I'm trying not to compare myself to Joel and Callie, at least right now,
Okay.
because I know they had good theses, and so I'm hoping they're not judging me. But
That's okay. As I was reading through your paper, one of the things that I noticed is there were a lot of articles from like medical journals or some doctorish kind of things, right? There were a handful of things from MCA, Brothers K, and Great Expectations, but there weren't many of those from earlier in your life. And so, what other books have you read at MCA that you feel like discussed grief or potentially started this conversation, opened your eyes towards this idea of grief?
I think reading through all the Shakespeare, is it all the Shakespeare books that we read? They all deal with death in drastically different ways that are not good.
Okay. Drastic different ways, dealing with death, not good. Summary of Shakespeare and all his works. So, okay. Any other ones?
I wasn't a good student freshman, sophomore year. I don't really remember them.
Then let's go back to eighth grade Eli. Eighth grade Eli, remember anything about grief in the things you read in Great Books 1?
Is that the Iliad?
Iliad?
Odyssey?
Odyssey.
Okay. Not really. I didn't do much thinking back then.
Maybe it's because the people we are associating with. So throughout your time here, whether you were thinking about it or not, we have the Iliad where Achilles loses Patroclus. We have the Odyssey where Telemachus loses his father and grows up without a dad and has to become a man. Penelope loses Odysseus. You have all the Greek tragedies where someone dies because of someone else, and then someone else dies. Basically, Shakespeare before Shakespeare, right? Bad ways of death. You have Shakespeare, Dante. There's grief throughout all these books. but I don't remember grief ever coming up with like metaphysics or like philosophy books. And so, what is it about grief that allows us to perceive it in epic poetry or Greek tragedies, where if it was included in metaphysics, like we're just going to be, that's tone deaf. I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to think about it.
I think because grief is both emotional and just mental for two different like spectrums, because there's the emotional side of grief that everybody looks at, and then there's the outward view on grief, which is more mentally draining for someone instead of emotionally draining.
Okay. So why is it that poetry, why is it that poetry would connect to both of those things where potentially philosophy books don't connect to those things?
Because so you they're written in the way that you will think about it. Like it's the main topic or underlying topic of a poem. It's to make you feel something.
Okay. Yeah, the poetry makes us feel. The stories make us relate, right? It like in all of this, there seems to be a tension between humans desiring to see something physical and then struggling when we don't see the physical, and then perceiving something else, right? And we act against that, trying to comfort someone in their grief, or potentially we're focused on the wrong things, so we have horrible deaths, right? It's a one of those things that just stuck out was like in the poetry, the focus is beauty, and within our grief, it's this. You just said it. It's the loss of something that was good or something that was beautiful, and so for us, um, to be able to perceive that beauty and good is a way that God has like intertwined his goodness in this creation for us to experience. But for us as children, it's that we get to see a dog, right? And I, this is sad, but I bought a dog for my kids so they would have to deal with death, hopefully in a little way before they have to deal with death in a bigger way, right? And like, so for kids, it's like, here's this introductory piece for, that wasn't the only reason. For junior high and high school, we give them poetry. We give them these stories so that they can see the way humans wrestle with this. And so for you, you've gone through childhood. Now you're about to graduate. What do you think your perception, or what do you think aspects of grief that you'll see differently in 10 more years will be?
I think right now I see it in a I think I'll be more okay with sitting with it, because it's still weird and awkward around someone. And so I think just growing and being able to be more comfortable in myself around it.
Do you think that as we mature, we're more likely to go seek help in dealing with the grief? Or do you think we're more likely to try to do it all ourselves?
I think it depends on the person, obviously, but I think little kids would seek out help. Then you get to your teens and early 20s, and I think you're going to try to do it all yourself. And then later on, I think you would seek help because you've hopefully grown connections with people that you can seek the help from.
And you've tried, right? We've tried to do it ourselves,
Mhm.
and so we can see some value in it. So, man, I would like to talk more about eighth grade Eli, as you know. But at this point in time, really, we would like the conversation to be able to shift and let you ask your panel questions.
Okay.
And so, You get a chance to ask
I
questions
have
now.
one question for all of you, and then Ms. Schultz, you get a bonus question. So, just talking about expectations of life and growing up and what we think we're going to do. What did y'all think you were going to do growing up, or even like into college? What did you think you were going to spend your life doing?
Thought I was going to be a professional baseball player until I made it to college, and the coach said, "You're not that good." And so then I had to deal with reality, and I tried to find something else that maybe I'd be better at than baseball. So
Initially going off to college, my plan was to get a degree in accounting, because ultimately I wanted to join the Secret Service. But after my freshman year of college, I realized I hated accounting. And then I met the woman who was going to be my wife and decided, you know what? I don't think having a wife and a family would be um, would blend very well with the type of career I was looking at pursuing. And then by God's grace, I wound up back here at MCA teaching, not by any plan of my own, but it was very different from my expectations, but it was also, I think, a much better thing.
My plan was always to get married and to have 4 kids. And that's what I prayed for, and that's what I always wanted. And so when I went to college, I was like, what could I do to enable me to work if I needed to, but still be a mom and available for my kids? And so teaching was naturally what I wanted to do because I thought I'll have the same schedule as my kids. So that's what I chose.
Okay, and your bonus question. You've known me since I was 6. Kindergarten. I'm not going to give you restraints, but don't. What's your favorite memory of like just something that's happened?
So yes, I would say since you were 6, I mean, my first memory of talking with your mom was at the kindergarten tea, and she was green, 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 green. I was like, "Are you okay?" And she said, "Yes, I'm pregnant with with Mariel," and she was very ill. And so, not, I mean, just because she had morning sickness. Um, so yes, I've watched you. You've been in a lot of classes with Judah, and I would say that you have always, I mean, I can't even tell you how many times he walked into my office. 99% of the time when you walk in my office, you just walk in laughing, like always laughing. You got some story, a lot of fun. When I think of you in my mind, I think of a smash up between like Smeagol and Dobby smashed together with this mischievous grin. And so I think my favorite memory is one time when, I mean, like you said, I've known you since 6. So my favorite memory would be the time that I took you and Judah and Ethan to my grandparents' ranch, and you guys went playing outside. You were playing, and the next day I went into my grandmother's barn, and there was a box of fireworks that had, I mean, literally looked like Tasmanian devil had gone through this, and fireworks were everywhere, spread everywhere. And I was so angry. And so I was like, what in the world? Then I started noticing there's a lot of burnt fireworks. Like, so I called you and your friends out. I said, what in the world were y'all doing? And you looked at me and you said, Mrs. Schultz, you don't understand. We had to light the fireworks in the barn because the wind was blowing and we didn't want a grass fire to happen. So we were really being careful. And I was like, but what about the very old barn with the very dry wood? And the best part of this story is it's not when he was 6 or 7 or 8. This is last year. So I love you very much, Eli. You're a joy, and I wish you the best. And Mr. Nelson's going to pray us out.
Please pray with me. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you, Lord, for Eli. I thank you for putting this topic on his heart. I know it's a difficult topic, but it's one that needs to be discussed. And I just pray, Lord, that you'll use the grief that he's experienced in his life, that you will use it for your purpose, both for him and for those around Eli that he comes in contact with. And I just pray that ultimately it'll all be turned for something good, and that's at the end of all things, something good will come out of it. I pray that you will please be with us for the remainder of the senior thesis week, and please bless our last week of school. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.